The morning after the funeral, Clara Voss walked out to the porch before sunrise and stood there in her socks on the cold wooden boards, looking at the land. It was November. The fields had already been harvested. Walter had seen to that, at least, before the accident, and what remained was a kind of vast, brown stillness that stretched from the edge of the yard all the way to where the sky decided to begin. 1,700 acres. She had known the number for years. Had heard Walter say it with a kind of quiet reverence the way some men say the name of a river they grew up fishing. 1,700 acres. The words had always belonged to him. Now they belonged to her. She was 25 years old. She still had a small scar on her chin from falling off a bicycle when she was 9. She still called her mother every Sunday. She still hadn't decided what to do with Walter's reading glasses, which was sitting on the nightstand on his side of the bed, folded neatly, as if he'd only step away for a moment. She didn't cry that morning. Not because she wasn't broken, but because something else had settled into her chest alongside the grief, something quieter and harder to name. Something that felt less like courage and more like the simple, animal understanding that the ground beneath her feet was still there, and that it needed her. And that needing something back might be the only rope long enough to pull herself through the days ahead. She went inside, put the kettle on, and opened the farm ledger. Walter Voss had been 31 when he died. He'd been checking a fence post along the north pasture. Something had spooked the cattle near the creek, and the tractor rolled on uneven ground. The county coroner said it was fast. Clara held that sentence like a stone in her pocket for months, turning it over and over, unsure whether it was a comfort or just a different kind of grief. He had been a careful man. That was what people kept saying at the funeral, which Clara found both true and quietly insufficient. Walter was careful with his words, careful with his tools, careful with the small rituals of a working farm, the way he sharpened blades on Sunday evenings, the way he walked the perimeter of every new field before he ever drove equipment across it. He had been careful, and still the land had taken him, and Clara didn't know what to do with that particular mathematics. The ledger was what she had. She spread it open on the kitchen table after the kettle boiled and sat there with her tea going cold while she read through his handwriting. Column after column of figures: seed costs, fuel receipts, loan payments, yield estimates, equipment maintenance logs. Walter had kept records the way his father had taught him, by hand, in ink, without shortcuts. The pages were soft at the corners from handling. Some entries had small notations beside them in a second, slightly smaller script: observations, really, more than numbers. Eastfield draining slow after rain. Check culvert spring. Or new hydraulic line on the combine. Parts from Hendricks, not Bauer. Bauer charges for the name. Clara read every page. It took her 3 evenings. She had no agricultural training beyond what she'd absorbed in 4 years of marriage, following Walter through fields on weekends, asking questions, listening. She had a degree in education. She had taught 3rd grade for 2 years before deciding she wanted to be home, closer to the farm, closer to the life they were building. She had been planning to go back to teaching in the spring. That plan now felt like something from another person's life. What she understood, after 3 evenings with the ledger, was that the farm was not in immediate danger of failing. But it was not healthy either. The combine was 14 years old and had developed a persistent problem with the grain elevator chain that Walter had been managing with replacement parts and patience. The irrigation pump on the south acreage was operating at reduced capacity. There was a line of credit at the bank that had grown modestly larger over the past 2 seasons after a disappointing corn yield. None of it was catastrophic. All of it required attention, skill, and money she wasn't certain she had. She also understood, reading between his careful columns, that Walter had been quietly worried. Not panicked, he wasn't that kind of man, but the small notations told a story of someone who was watching several things at once, aware that the margin for error was thinner than he wanted it to be. Clara closed the ledger. She thought about selling. Of course she did. Her parents, her sister, Walter's brother Dale, they all suggested it, gently, in the weeks following the funeral. You don't have to do this alone, Clara. Which was true. But what she heard underneath it was something else. You can't do this alone. And those were 2 very different sentences. She thought about what Walter had said once, early in their marriage, when she'd ask him what he would do if the farm failed. He'd looked at her with that particular stillness he had, like a man who'd already considered the question from every angle, and said, "It won't. Not I won't let it. Just, it won't." She had asked him how he could be so sure. He'd smiled and said, "Because the land remembers what it needs. You just have to learn to listen." She hadn't fully understood that then. She was beginning to understand it now. Word travels the way weather does in a farming county, low and wide and without asking permission. By December, everyone within 40 miles knew that Clara Voss was keeping the farm. And with that knowledge came the watching. It wasn't unkind, mostly. People in that part of Iowa had a particular way of expressing concern that looked almost identical to skepticism. And Clara had to learn to hold both possibilities at once without letting either one in too far. The men at the grain elevator would pause when she came in, that half-second recalibration in their posture, before resuming whatever conversation she'd interrupted. The equipment dealer, a man named Garth who had sold Walter 3 pieces of machinery over the years, spoke to her in the patient, simplified tone of someone who had already decided how much she could absorb. She absorbed everything. She drove out to the combine on a cold Tuesday morning in December, just to look at it. She had watched Walter work on it enough times to know its general shape and personality. She climbed up into the cab and sat there for a while, not starting it, just sitting. The cab smelled of dust and diesel and something faintly sweet she couldn't identify. Some residue from the last harvest, maybe, or just the smell of years. There was a small laminated card taped to the dashboard in Walter's handwriting, a checklist of pre-operation steps. Below it, a photograph of Clara and Walter at their wedding, slightly curled at one corner, stuck there with a strip of electrical tape. She hadn't known it was there. She sat in the combined cab for a long time after finding that photograph. She hired a mechanic named Reuben in January, a quiet man in his 50s who had worked on farm equipment his entire life and who charged fairly and spoke only when he had something worth saying. Reuben spent 2 full days on the combine elevator chain and came back to her with a list of what needed doing and what it would cost. She looked at the list carefully, asked him 3 questions. He answered all 3 without condescension. "You know what you're asking," he said, almost to himself. "I'm learning," she said. He nodded as if that were the correct answer. She also called the County Agricultural Extension Office that month. A woman named Beverly answered, and when Clara explained her situation, recently widowed, 1,700 acres, limited practical experience, Beverly didn't hesitate. She scheduled a farm visit within the week and arrived in a pickup truck with a worn canvas bag full of soil reports, drainage maps, and planting guides. Beverly was in her 60s and had the particular confidence of someone who had spent decades being underestimated. She and Clara sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours, talking through the land, the credit line, the equipment, the plan. "Most people in your situation, Sel," Beverly said, not unkindly. "I know," Clara said. "Why aren't you?" Clara thought about it genuinely. Not the answer she gave her parents or her sister or Dale, but the real one. "Because Walter believed it was possible," she said. "And I think I need to find out if he was right." Beverly looked at her for a moment, then wrote something in her notebook. "All right," she said. "Let's figure out what you have." What Clara had, Beverly determined, was more than people assumed. The land itself was excellent, deep, well-draining soil with good organic content, consistent yields when properly managed. The south irrigation issue was solvable. The credit line was manageable if this year's planting went well. The combine needed work but was not beyond repair. What she didn't have was experience, extra capital, or the goodwill of men who had already decided the outcome. She didn't have those things. But she had the ledger, and the land, and the photograph on the dashboard, and a woman named Beverly with a canvas bag full of maps. She decided that was enough to start. Spring came with the particular urgency that farmers learn to recognize before anyone else does, something in the quality of light, the smell of the ground thawing. The way the horizon seems to push itself further away. Clara felt it for the first time as her own that March. Not Walter's spring. Hers. She had spent the winter learning. Every evening after dark she read extension bulletins, soil science guides, old copies of farm journals she found in the barn, stacked in a wooden crate near the workbench. Some of them were Walter's father's. She read those too. The language was technical and dry and she pushed through it slowly, looking things up when she needed to, building vocabulary the way you build a fence, one post at a time. Checking each one before moving to the next. She also walked the land. This was Beverly's instruction, given simply. Walk every field before you plant it. Not in the tractor. On foot. So Clara walked. She wore Walter's rubber boots because her own weren't tall enough, and she walked the east fields and the north fields and the long. slightly undulating stretch of the south acreage where the irrigation pump was being repaired. She walked in rain, and she walked in cold wind, and she walked on the days when the sky was pale and cloudless and the only sound was the soft pull of her boots through mud. She began to understand what Walter had meant about listening. It wasn't mystical. It was just attention, close, sustained, patient attention. The way a field held water after rain, the way certain sections dried faster. The slight rise in the northwest corner of the east field that Reuben had mentioned offhandedly, and that she now understood would affect drainage in a wet year. Small things. The kind of things that only reveal themselves to someone willing to go slowly. She planted corn in May. Soybeans in the south fields where the rotation called for it. She hired 2 seasonal workers, brothers named Manny and Teo, who had worked the surrounding farms for years and who, after the first week, seemed to make a quiet collective decision to stop waiting for her to make obvious mistakes. There were mistakes. The planting schedule on the west acreage went 2 days behind when a part for the planter arrived late. She miscalculated the seed rate on a section of the north field and had to adjust mid-run. One morning the irrigation pump stopped working again and she spent 4 hours on the phone with the repair company, learning, by the end of the call, more than she had expected to about submersible pump mechanics. She wrote all of it down. In the ledger, in Walter's format, with her own small notations beside the numbers. Westfield. Planter delay cost us optimal window. Order earlier next year. Or pump, primary issue was worn impeller, not the valve. Reuben was right. One evening in June, she was writing in the ledger at the kitchen table when she noticed something she hadn't seen in her first reading. At the back of the book, behind the last active page, there were 3 additional sheets, folded once, tucked into the binding. She unfolded them carefully. They were calculations. Long, detailed projections, yield estimates, equipment replacement timelines, soil improvement plans. Detailed in a way that went beyond what someone managing a farm for 1 season would need. These were 5-year plans. 10-year plans. Her name appeared in a margin note beside a projected figure for year 7. By then Clara will know the south field better than I do. She sat with that sentence for a very long time. Clara didn't tell anyone about the hidden pages for several weeks. She carried them in the way you carry something fragile, careful, aware, not quite ready to hold it up to the light. She thought about the version of Walter she'd known as a husband versus the version she was discovering in these pages. They weren't different men. But there was a dimension she hadn't had full access to while he was alive. The private, forward-thinking, quietly certain part of him that had been looking years ahead without saying so. He had believed in the farm with a specificity she hadn't fully understood. And he had believed in her capacity to understand it too, though she had never been sure of that herself. The summer was difficult. The heat in July was sustained in a way that required careful irrigation management, and Clara spent several long days monitoring moisture levels and adjusting run times. The corn in the east field showed stress in the 3rd week of July and she caught it early, because she was walking the fields, because she was paying attention, and adjusted irrigation before it caused permanent damage. Manny told her later that the farm 3 miles north had lost a significant portion of their east crop to the same weather. You caught it, he said simply. She had. Because she was there. Because she was paying attention. Because she had read enough to know what stressed corn looked like and walked enough to see it before it was too late. In August, Garth from the equipment dealership stopped by, not to sell her anything, she realized, but simply to see. He walked the equipment yard with her, looked at the combine that Reuben had repaired in spring, asked a few questions about the season. She answered them all precisely. He nodded at the end. Said, Walter would be pleased. It was the right thing to say and she thanked him for it. But later, driving the tractor along the north field perimeter in the long evening light, she thought about what it meant, Walter would be pleased, and found that the sentence, while true, was incomplete. Because this wasn't only about Walter. This was about her, and the land, and the particular form of understanding that had grown between them over 8 months of early mornings and wet boots and ink-stained fingers. She had come to know the farm the way you come to know a person, slowly, through its small moods and its reliable habits, through what it concealed and what it offered freely. She could feel, by August, when a field was ready and when it needed more time. She could read the sky for rain with a competence that wasn't intuition but accumulated observation. She had crossed, without celebrating it, some threshold she couldn't have named in January. Beverly came for a second visit in late August, at Clara's invitation. They walked the south acreage together, Beverly occasionally stopping to crouch and press her fingers into the soil, holding it and releasing it in that particular way of hers. Better than last year's reports showed it could be, Beverly said. I've been amending it, Clara said. She explained the composting approach she'd started in spring, something she'd found referenced in one of Walter's father's old journals and cross-referenced with a more recent extension bulletin. That takes patience, Beverly said. I have patience, Clara said, and realized, saying it, that it was true in a way it might not have been before. September arrived with the smell of dust and maturity that Clara now recognized as the scent of something kept. The corn was ready. She knew it before the moisture meter confirmed it, could feel it in the density of the stalks, the papery dry sound the husks made in the wind. She and Manny and Teo and Reuben, who came out to run the combine on harvest days because that was the arrangement they'd fallen into and because he seemed to want to see how the season ended, worked. The east fields first. Then the north. Then the long stretch of the west acreage where the delayed planting had worried her. The yield was good. Not exceptional. Not a record year. But good. Solid and honest and hard-earned in a way that felt different from simply reading a number. She stood at the grain elevator at the end of the first week of harvest and watched the corn being transferred into the bins and felt something she hadn't quite felt before. Not triumph. Not vindication. Something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. Something that felt like belonging. Dale came by in the second week of harvest. Walter's brother. He had offered to help in January and she had thanked him and declined, and he had respected that, though she'd seen what it cost him. He was a good man, Dale, different from Walter in temperament, louder, less patient, but loyal in his way. He walked out to the combine and stood watching it work the north field from the edge of the tree line, hands in his jacket pockets. When she came over to him during a break, he didn't say anything at first, just stood there watching the combine move. Then, he'd have been proud of you. He was already proud of me, Clara said. Before this. Dale looked at her quickly, then away. Nodded. Yeah, he said. He was. She showed Dale the folded pages from the back of the ledger that evening. He sat at the kitchen table and read them slowly, tracing the handwriting with one finger the way you trace something you're afraid might disappear. When he got to the margin note, by then Clara will know the south field better than I do, he looked up at the ceiling for a long moment. His jaw moved without producing sound. He wrote that months before, Clara said. Before the accident. Maybe 2 years before, from the ink and the paper. He knew, Dale said. Not a question. He knew I'd be here, Clara said carefully. Not that he'd be gone. Just that I'd be here. That I was capable of being here. There was a difference, she decided, between those two things. A crucial difference. Walter hadn't written those pages as a contingency plan for his death. He had written them as a vision of their shared future, one in which Clara would eventually come to know this land as fully as he did. The future had arrived ahead of schedule and without him. But the vision itself, the belief in her, had been there all along, quiet and certain and waiting to be found. That was what changed things. Not what he had done, exactly, but what he had believed, and taken the time to record, in ink, in columns, in the careful language of a man who trusted the act of writing things down. She slept well that night for the first time in months. The soybeans in the south field were the last to come in. Clara saved them deliberately, not because they needed more time but because she wanted to end the harvest season there, on the field that had given her the most difficulty. The one that Beverly had watched most carefully, the one Walter's margin note had mentioned by name. She drove the combine herself on the last day. Reuben had offered and she thanked him and told him she wanted to do this one herself. He nodded, and she understood that he understood. The morning was cool and perfectly clear, the kind of October sky that seems to have been cleaned overnight, that particular blue that Midwestern people recognize as the brief. Borrowed blue before winter takes hold. She sat in the combine cab for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the south field through the dusty glass. The soybeans stood in their rows, tan and dry and ready, the way things are ready when they've done everything they were supposed to do and now simply wait for the recognition. She looked at the photograph on the dashboard. Walter and her at the wedding, curled at one corner, held there with electrical tape by the hands of a man she had loved and lost and was still, in her way, learning. She started the engine. The south field came in clean. Better than the projections, better than the previous year's recorded yield for that acreage, better than what the soil report in February had suggested was likely. Not dramatically so, This wasn't a fairy tale, and the land didn't traffic in dramatic gestures, but measurably, verifiably, solidly better. Clara knew why. The composting in spring, the adjusted irrigation management, the soil amendment she'd applied after Beverly's March visit. Small decisions, each one modest in isolation, combining over months into something real. When the last row was finished and she brought the combine to a stop at the edge of the field, she sat in the cab for a long time. She thought about the year, all of it, from the cold November morning on the porch to this. She thought about Beverly with her canvas bag and Reuben with his quiet competence and Manny and TEO and their eventual, wordless shift in how they moved around her. She thought about Dale's finger tracing Walter's handwriting. She thought about the folded pages. She thought about a man who sharpened blades on Sunday evenings and believed, with a steady and private certainty, that the woman he loved would someday know this land as well as he did. She thought about the phrase that had followed her since January, the phrase people said with that slight tilt of concern or doubt or both, "You can't do this alone." She hadn't done it alone. She had done it with the memory of a careful man and the knowledge left in his handwriting and the help of people who showed up. But she had also done it herself, with her own hands and her own attention and her own willingness to walk every field on foot in cold rain and read until her eyes ached and asked questions until she understood the answers. Both things were true. She had not done it alone. And she had done it herself. The world, she had discovered, was large enough to hold both of those truths at once. She climbed down from the combine in the October afternoon. The south field stretched around her, quiet and harvested and spent in the best possible sense of that word, not emptied, but completed. Given. She stood at its edge and put her hand flat against one of the remaining soybean stems, feeling its dry, papery texture, the particular brittleness of something that has done its work. The land remembered what it needed. She had learned to listen. She picked up her phone and called Beverly. The south field came in, she said. How much? Beverly asked. Clara told her. There was a pause. Then Beverly said, well, yeah, Clara said. Same plan next year? Clara looked out across the field. Thought about the 5-year projections in the back of the ledger. Thought about the 10-year ones. Same plan, she said. And then some. She went back to the house as the light began to soften into evening. The sky over the farm was doing what it does in October, turning colors that don't quite have names, the kind of deep orange and gray gold that makes even flat land look mythic. She sat down at the kitchen table, opened the ledger to the next blank page, and picked up a pen. She wrote the date at the top. Below it, the final harvest figures, field by field, careful and complete. Below that, her own margin note, Southfield, better than projected. Soil amendment worth the investment. Repeat and expand next spring. She paused. Then she added, Walter was right. She didn't mean about the farm, exactly. Or not only that. She meant about all of it, the land and its patience, and what a person could become when they decided to stay and learn and pay attention. And what it meant to be believed in before you believed in yourself. She closed the ledger. Outside, the farm was settling into the quiet that comes after harvest, that particular stillness of land that has given everything it had and is now, simply, resting. 1,700 acres of it. Hers, in every sense that word could hold. She sat for a while longer at the table, in the house that still held his shape in 100 small ways, the reading glasses on the nightstand, the boots by the door that were too big for her and that she wore anyway, the handwriting in the columns of the book she'd just closed. And she thought about what it means to be believed in quietly, not announced, not insisted upon, but written down and left, like seeds in good soil, for someone to find when they needed it most. She wondered how many people walk through their lives not knowing that someone, somewhere, had already written their name in a margin and trusted them completely. How many of us are already believed in, by someone who didn't survive long enough to say it out loud, and simply haven't found the page yet? The kettle began to whistle. She got up, made the tea, and let the farm rest.